Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is our reporter, Tim Clauser, and we're discussing the Spokane Transit Authority wanting to join a list of government agencies that want to avoid maintaining a public records index because it's unduly burdensome. Tim, there's some people who feel like that's not adding up. What's going on?
Yeah, so the state Public Records Act, essentially the law that allows you and me and any member of the public to request budget, internal communications, all this stuff from government agencies and different government bodies. It was a voter-approved law in the 70s, and at the time of its passage, it included this provision that said, "Hey, you are required to maintain a public record index." Which is essentially a physical. SDA, the Spokane Transit Association, sees it as a physical logbook. So you would think like you used to have a Rolodex on your desk with all of your sources' contacts, but now you just have a contact log on your phone. Well, in this case, a public records index would be a book with all of the public records available that someone could just go into a government building and view in person rather than digitally. So the Spokane Transit Association is essentially arguing that, look, modern technology predates this, and they're looking to go after an exemption so they don't have to maintain an index, saying that maintaining this public record index would be unduly burdensome on the agency and it would interfere with agency operations. Now, state law allows them to do this if they specify the reasons why doing so would be unduly burdensome. But there's not a lot of specific as to whether or not they have to provide data on costs or not. But essentially, the board passed this resolution this week saying that, we're not going to do this. It's unduly burdensome to us. But when the chief financial officer of STA was giving the presentation and their legal counsel weighed in too, none of them mentioned how much it would cost. They just said, yeah, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be expensive. We're not going to do it. A lot of other places do this too. So why don't we just go after this exemption too? It makes sense. But George Irv, the secretary for the Washington Coalition for Open Government, I was talking to him about this, and he kind of pointed out that it might not be as unduly burdensome as the Transit Association or Transit Authority is making it out to seem. State auditors report of the agency's finances for 2025 note that when you look at their spending, they had a budget of, I think it was like 156 around there $1 million in revenue for 2024, and then they spent about 135 or 138 million dollars. So they had a lot of money to spend. But then that same year, they reported data to the state saying that they only spent $43,000 fulfilling records requests that year. A lot of money, but when you think of it, $43,000 is about a third of 1%,
Yeah.
0.03% of their annual spending. So, I mean, if you have to spend a fraction of a percent of your budget on fulfilling records requests, can you really say that it's unduly burdensome? And I had reached out to the agency about this. They didn't respond when I had sent them the budget data showing that it's only a fraction of a percent of their spending. But they essentially just said, modern technology predates a physical record index book. And I said, well, did you do a cost analysis? Did you look at how much staff time it would take to maintain such an index? And the authority's response was, STA didn't identify a need to do such a cost study.
I see. I'm still hung up on the 0.03% of the agency's total spending. Um, if it was 10%, 15, 12%, that would make sense. But this is like a rounding error on a budget.
Yeah. And they had a few hundred records requests according to the state data for 2024. Whereas like if you look to other major cities, instead of like a transit association, turn to the city of Spokane or Bellevue and these other places, they're looking at thousands of records requests that they're spending. Some agencies are spending thousands of dollars on a single records request. I believe SDA said they're spending about $100 on each records request. But I could maybe understand more if it was they were having to spend tens of thousands of dollars on every records request. And there's all these thousands of ones, but there's a few hundred records requests that they spent $43,000 on in 2024. They're not spending millions of dollars on this. Maybe they're spending a lot of staff time on that, but they didn't provide any data on that. They didn't provide any data to the board. In some board member, Michael Cathcart, on the SDA board when they approved this, he said, I understand the burden that this would place on SDA, but they never painted the burden for them. They just said it would be expensive. Uh, they didn't talk about how it would only be a fraction of a percent of the budget.
Yeah.
I think it also raises the question as to whether or not state lawmakers should revisit this exemption in state law, because so many agencies adopt this, saying maintaining this index would be unduly burdensome. State law, the state administrative code, it even recognizes that modern technology kind of predates the index, but it says you could do a virtual index, and it suggests that agencies do that. But it raises the question as to if all of the biggest agencies in the state are going to go after this exemption and they're saying that it predates modern technology, is the exemption still need to be in state law? Should they revisit this and take the exemption away? Or should they add more specifics, saying, if you're going to take the exemption, you need to actually prove that it's going to be unduly burdensome, rather than just saying it's expensive? I could go to the grocery store and look at milk and say, oh, well, that's expensive. Compared to what?
Right. Right. Yeah, this is definitely interesting. And obviously, it's of concern for taxpayers and us as people in the media whenever there's issues of access to public records and making it easier or more difficult to obtain what we're looking for. So we appreciate your coverage on this, Tim, and listeners can keep up with this story and others at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. Thank you for listening to this episode of Washington in Focus.